So my name is Louise Houghton. I'm one of the co-directors at the Bylines Network, and tonight is the second in our Bylines Debate for Progress series. This was the brainchild of Sam Chandler, who wanted to demonstrate that we could bring progressive voices together to debate topics in a constructive and fun way, demonstrating, we hope, that while we don't agree on details always, we're pretty much always singing from the same hymn sheet, we hope. Tonight's debate asks, what climate action should the next government prioritise? And I was just saying to the speakers earlier, we probably all want all four of the options tonight to be absolutely top priority. And we have others, I'm sure. But if you had those first 100 days in office on the Prime Minister's desk, which of the four options that we have today do you think absolutely has to be on the desk when the next Prime Minister comes to power? So there's cross-party consensus on the need for urgent action to combat the climate emergency. Since taking office, Rishi Sunak has established a Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and has made several climate announcements in a recent Green Day. Meanwhile, Labour has pledged to invest 28 billion in green energy, in addition to banning new oil and gas licenses in the North Sea. So whoever leads the next government, climate change is going to be high on the agenda. So tonight we have four excellent, rather superb speakers. Thank you to every single one of you for saying yes and joining us tonight. We're very, very excited by this. We're going to have, the format is going to be each speaker will have 5 minutes to pitch their idea. And then the other speakers can ask some questions, and so can we. So please do put your questions in the chat. Jules, who's moderating for us tonight, has already shared the link to Slido so that you can ask questions. You've also all had the questionnaire, the survey that we sent out by email, and also that's also in the chat. If you've not filled that in, please do. We know that if you're on a mobile phone, this is a little bit tricky, so apologies for that. But if you can vote, that's great. It's a single transferable vote to order your answers for which you think is the best. And then we're going to ask again at the end of this session to see whether the speakers tonight have changed that preference from you. If you can't access it, please don't worry. It's not a general election. It's not the end of the world, but it might just be the most important vote that we have today. So without further ado, we're going to hand over to Carla, who is our first speaker tonight. Carla has been co-leader of the Green Party of England and Wales for almost 2 years now. She is also city councillor in Bristol, which in 2018 became the first council in Europe to declare a climate emergency. Now, this is where I checked with Wikipedia. Carla studied mechanical engineering at Durham and has a particular interest in ethical investment, but her pitch tonight is on housing and insulation. So over to you, Carla.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. Yeah, so I'm Carla, co-leader of the Green Party, but yes, my background is in engineering. I used to work in renewable energy, and the reason I made the switch to politics is because while engineering is certainly a worthy career, I could see that the main barriers to tackling climate change were actually not, for the most part, the technology, but the political will. So here we are. The premise of this evening is that we each present a different focus, which should be the government priority, and you'll be asked to vote. But the reality is, as Louise said, we need to pursue many different solutions in parallel at a pace we've never seen before. I'm not generally a fan of war analogies, but the parallel with the war footing that the UK put itself into at the start of World War II is really accurate here, I feel. Infrastructure, manufacturing facilities, cross-party political cooperation, public information engagement, a role for everyone. These are all things we can learn. So my pitch is not for a panacea, but for a substantial part of the solution. And importantly, it's one that can be implemented straight away and which reduces the energy use we need, the energy we need to use in our homes, because the cleanest, greenest possible energy is the energy that we don't have to use. So what's the problem? Around 19% of the UK's carbon footprint is from the energy that's needed to heat, cool and power our buildings. And 80% of buildings which will be occupied in 2050 in the UK already exist. So that means decarbonising our existing housing stock is a major priority. The UK has some of the worst performing housing stock in Europe for energy efficiency and fuel poverty, and that's been driving the cost of living crisis. Yet, despite warm words, the government seems to have put insulation on the back burner, with almost nothing on insulation in its heat and building strategy last year. And this is part of a long tradition from the Conservatives of first bungling and then scrapping measures that decarbonise homes. Worse yet, present and past governments have allowed new homes to be built that are not any better than the ones we've already got. 10 years ago, the coalition government scrapped the Code for Sustainable Homes under the pretext of tidying it up and merging with building standards, but unfortunately the real consequence was a watering down of those standards. And the planning system too could be helping, but is currently hindering housing decarbonisation. So what are the solutions? A nationwide home insulation programme that would invest £25 billion a year for over 10 years to carry out the deep retrofitting of 10 million homes, prioritising those lived in by the people on low incomes first, so that they benefit from the reduced heating bills too, plus lighter touch insulation improvements for every home that needs it. We know that this can be done. To fund it, plus the renewable energy revolution that needs to happen alongside, we would introduce a carbon tax targeting the biggest fossil fuel polluters. Carbon tax is a policy which has an incredible 94% public support. 94% of Brits don't agree about anything, but they agree about this, and yet the Greens are the only party to back it. This nationwide home insulation programme is a key part of a broader policy, the Green New Deal, which will ensure homes are warm and comfortable, we reduce our carbon emissions, and we create thousands of green jobs. And that's a key point here too, because aside from the unstable, unpredictable government policy and the lack of investment that have blocked a nationwide home insulation programme really taking off, another blocker is the lack of a large, skilled retrofit workforce and supply chain to do that work. That's why it's so important to build up that workforce through education, so through further education colleges, but also through, for example, councils proactively choosing to hire local for retrofit work on their council housing, which builds up local supply chains in their area, and that local supply chain can then turn its attention to the private sector. That idea is part of a green-led plan already happening in Sussex called the Lewis model, where Lewis Council is the lead local authority working with its neighbours. And there's much more that local councils can do right now as well, from streamlining planning applications for common types of housing retrofit, which Westminster Council is doing, so I imagine we might even hear something about that later, to bringing empty homes back into use and in the process renovating them to a high standard. But having the power to do something as a local council and having the resources are two different things. So national government needs to provide decent, stable funding for local government and better devolution so that councils can actually get on and do it. The solution's already there. The technology is already there. There are multiple benefits, not just carbon emissions, also giving people warmer, more comfortable, healthier, cheaper to heat homes. The blockers are national policy and skills and supply chains. And these are things that national government has the power to fix and should be one of its first priorities.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carla. Right. Well, while people are thinking and putting some questions in the chat there, I want to give first refusal to Leo, Ryan and Vera. Did you have anything you wanted to ask Carla in response to what she'd said before we throw it open to the rest of the room? You don't have to, but you do get the perk of first refusal. You'll have to, there we go, Ryan's on mute.
Happy to jump in with a question. Thanks, Carla. Obviously, insulation is really key if we're going to meet our goals. You know what I'm going to be arguing for in a second. So in the intro, Louise mentioned you have an interest in ethical investing. You've talked about the funding that councils need. How are you proposing we fund the mass retrofit plan? And if green finance isn't the first priority, how do we get to the levels that we need?
Well, I mean, you're not going to find an enemy from me here. I do think that green finance is really important. But as I touched on briefly in my rapid fire 5 minutes, the way the Greens would fund this plus an investment in renewable energy as well is through a carbon tax. So that is kind of similar to what the government eventually brought in after pressure from Greens, Lib Dems and Labour on the windfall tax. It would be a permanent version, and it would be without the massive glaring loophole that is currently in the windfall tax, which means that fossil fuel companies can get back 91p in every pound if they invest, wait for it, not in renewable energy, in more oil and gas. So we would close that loophole and change it a little bit, because one-off windfall taxes and long-running carbon taxes would work slightly differently, but it's the same general gist, that we shouldn't be allowing companies to make massive profits off destroying our environment.
Louise, I'm not sure how to raise my hand on this. For some reason, it doesn't seem to work.
That was the best way, Vera. Thank you, because I couldn't see any more than 3 people anyway. So go for it.
So first of all, nobody can deny that this is a no-brainer as a policy. And in fact, the Liberal Democrats, Labour Party, the Greens in Parliament are always calling for this again and again. Absolutely, the barrier to it are the skills. The barrier is also that local people are confused about what is out there, what is actually what they can do. So there are all sorts of questions that need to be resolved before we can not before we can go for it, but there needs to be some more detail behind it. My biggest problem about this is, and the same with our policy that we went forward to in 2019, is that we talk about low income families, and then we are talking about some sort of incentive for owner occupiers. But what we do not address is actually private rented properties, because that's where now a lot of people live, and also a lot of low income people. And they don't get, they have to pay high energy bills, but they're not the ones who are making the decision of whether they can insulate their own homes. It's for the landlord to make that decision, and they don't see any benefit for it. So how would you actually resolve that? We are basically looking at some form of tax incentives for private rented landlords, but then you could say, well, then there's money going into the private sector if you wish. However, I cannot see how we can otherwise make sure that vulnerable households and low income families in privately rented properties can get their energy bill down.
Carla.
Yeah, Vera, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the problem there, that if we're going to do a whole nationwide retrofit of the housing stock, it's going to have to take a slightly different approach depending on whether it's council housing, housing association, private rented, or owner occupied. And even within owner occupied, say it's might depend on whether they've got a mortgage and what the income levels are. So I think it's going to have to be some kind of sliding scale, where obviously the council is responsible for all of it with council housing, that you're providing some support to owner occupiers, and then what do you do for that private housing market in the middle? Exactly. I think that it's bound to be some combination of tighter regulation to require much better energy efficiency if you are renting out. So there's already some regulation on that with energy performance certificates, with the required standards going up gradually. The trouble with that is that energy performance certificates are a very blunt instrument for estimating the energy efficiency of homes. So I would want to see a more accurate estimate of the actual functional energy efficiency rather than a sort of a rule of thumb. And I think that has to be coupled with some kind of support for landlords who really can't afford to do the work, but that would have to be designed very carefully to make sure that it's not just massive handouts to people who could afford to do it and are just resisting doing so.
Louise, can I just go back one more time? Don't you think that the EPC framework needs to be overhauled before we are going for this nationwide rollout of energy efficiency program? Because the EPC framework is currently, as you've already pointed out, creating sort of strange incentives and non-incentives. And shouldn't we do the EPC work and the overhaul of that before we are doing what you've just been proposing?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a neighbour who's recently swapped out their gas boiler for an electric boiler and has got a much worse EPC as a result. So yeah, very, very perverse incentives for people that are trying to get off fossil fuels. Personally, yes, I would prefer if the EPC system were updated first, but in a climate emergency, we can't always afford to finish one task before starting another. I was on a panel with a climate scientist a few years ago who whose partner happened to be a fireman, and she gave a really interesting analogy from his work that when you are in a blue light emergency, which we can learn from in this climate emergency, you know, the fire service will get the ladders up, get the hoses out, move people out of the way, and call for backup and make an evacuation plan all simultaneously rather than doing them sequentially. And yes, in an ideal world, perhaps we wouldn't do that, but this isn't an ideal world.
Okay, I have another question, slightly different, from Catherine via the Zoom chat. Surely server farmers are greater sources of heat and cooling. I recall that some server farms use equivalent energy as a city the size of Norwich. So is housing really the biggest win?
I don't have at my fingertips the percentage of energy consumption that's used by server farms, but I'd be quite surprised if it was more than the 19% of the UK carbon emissions caused by housing. Oh, Leo looks like he might. I'm going to give way so he can jump in if he's got that number to hand.
No, I don't have the number to hand, but I am, as point sources of demand for heating and cooling, yes, absolutely. And there's very good ways to leverage those because there's lots of waste heat that you can reuse to supply homes, indeed. But no,
indeed.
Carla is quite right. We're talking about it's a tiny fraction in the gestalt, in the whole scheme of things.
But on the plus side, because it's a point source, it is relatively easy to utilize that heat. And I know that there are various district heating schemes that either already are or are looking at using that heat to supply a heat network to help decarbonise people's heating. There'll be restrictions on that depending on where the data centre is, how close it is to centres of population, but it's definitely something that's worth investigating.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, well, unless there are any other questions, we're going to move on to Ryan, because I'm sure we'll be coming back round and we'll hear from Carla again later. So thank you very much. I'm going to introduce Ryan now, whose area of expertise comes from being Programme Director at the Green Finance Initiative. Let me just bring my notes ahead of me there. Where their mission is to accelerate the transition to a clean, resilient and environmentally sustainable economy by channeling capital at pace and scale towards real economy outcomes that will create jobs and increase prosperity for all. He is also Labour Party councillor and Deputy Cabinet Member, Climate Action and Biodiversity at Westminster City Council. So he's wearing two hats tonight. Over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Louise. So I think, as you said at the start, and as Carla touched on, it's quite an interesting debate we're having tonight, because the initial reaction is that everything being proposed here simply must be done as soon as possible if we're to achieve net zero. But the question is around what's the priority for the next government. I think that makes the answer a little bit easier, because there's one common thread that underpins all of the areas that we need action in, whether it's insulating our home, shifting to low carbon transport, scaling up renewables, nature restoration, or more. There's one thing that must be treated as priority from day one if any of those things are to be met, and that is ensuring we have enough green finance to fund all of this. So under the current government, we've seen the issue already with not mobilising finance. As Carla touched on, we've had lots of promises, good intentions, rhetoric spouted, but never with adequate funding to back it up, both in the form of public finance and also adequate regulation of the private finance sector to ensure that their money is going to where we need it to go. The Committee on Climate Change has said that we need just over £50 billion a year of climate finance in the UK to meet our net zero targets. Last time they crunched the numbers, it was only around 10 billion we were getting, so about a fifth of what we need. And again, none of the other policies that we're going to be discussing will happen if we don't fill this gap as a top priority from day one. So on to the how that this will be done. There are three main parts to this. The first is public finance, then regulation of the private sector, and thirdly, tracking of green financial flows. So on the first one, we need a government that's willing and ready to commit to long-term annual capital spend from the public purse that will invest into all sectors of the economy. So this should include everything from grant money to support people with the upfront cost of installing heat pumps and insulation, long-term commitments on money to go via local authorities for things such as charging infrastructure, and also expanding support for renewables and investing directly in some of the storage assets, public ownership that we need. And research shown that around £30 billion per year would be about right. And obviously that informed the Labour Party's policy. The second is on regulation. So we often hear that a lot of private sector financial institutions want to invest in sustainable outcomes, but currently there's a lack of clarity as to what is green, and also some that are purposefully greenwashing. So the government should accelerate development of a dictionary of what sustainable economic activities are, the so-called green taxonomy, which will then underpin everything, help us as the public track targets that private sector companies are committing to, increase transparency, and also enable regulators to find those that are overstepping the mark on claiming what's green. And all of this will enable more private sector investment to go to where we need it to go. And the third one, there's currently no ability to track how much finance is going towards net zero. So that £50 billion number I mentioned earlier. So the government as a priority needs to figure out, how do we track that? How do we see how much public or private capital is going towards it? Which will also enable the government to course correct if they see a sector where there isn't enough capital flowing. And given how quickly we need to get this done, how much we need to achieve over the next decade or so, this ability to quickly course correct with accurate tracking is really important. And that can only be achieved if we're tracking the amount of finance going into it. I'll also say that green in the financial system is not just a domestic argument. The UK has the world's largest financial centre. But if you were to look at the global emissions financed by the City of London, so the investments they made on an annual basis, it would make them the 9th largest emitting country in the world, almost double that of the UK's annual emissions, bigger than Germany, bigger than Canada. And as we know, a lot of these investments are going abroad, often to developing economies, and those developing economies will be suffering the worst impacts of climate change, despite having the least impact on the amount of warming that we've seen. So there's also a moral imperative for the UK to curb the financial system here through regulations, through that second pillar that I mentioned earlier. So to conclude, to reach our net zero targets, we must decarbonise every sector in the economy. To achieve this, we need substantial amounts of investment from the public and the private sector. The next government can ensure we manage this by massively scaling up the levels of public investment, targeting where it goes, regulating the private sector to enable them to direct investments where we need it to be, and also this ability to track financial flows so that we can hold the government to account, hold the private sector to account, and also be able to course correct where required. If green finance is not this top first climate priority, then as I've said, we won't be able to achieve any of the other policy areas that we all know we need to over the coming years.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a powerful case made there. And just to say to whoever's moderating, if that's Jules or Sam, I can't see all the speakers in this mode, so I won't be able to see if I think it's Vera I'm missing. Yes, it is. So just if she holds her hand up, somebody needs to let me know. So do any of our speakers have any questions for Ryan before we throw this out to our other guests? In which case, first question, do you think the EU's green taxonomy could be a starting point for the UK exercise? Ryan?
So yes, but also with lots of caveats and lots of asterisks. So the EU is the major trading partner of the UK in terms of capital flow, cross-border. So for investors and companies that operate across both, we need to have the same sort of framework as the EU. So that should be a starting point. That has been the starting point in the UK. The issue is that the EU has been quite caught up in a lot of political debates. They obviously have 27 member countries to try to keep happy. And what we've seen this achieve is that there has been some watering down of some criteria. So Carla mentioned a loophole in the windfall tax in the UK. A big loophole was put into the EU's taxonomy last year, which allows natural gas to be called green if it's replacing coal. Now, obviously, that is deemed to be nonsensical by a lot of people. There's been a lot of criticism from NGOs. In the UK, we're in a good position where we don't have that same issue that a lot of the Eastern European countries have. So we should be able to take the EU's base framework and improve upon it, make it better, fix some of these issues, and that should be the basis for the UK's taxonomy.
Okay. Another question than we had already. So Labour has recently clarified that their 28 billion commitment is to be reached by 2027. Is this a disappointment, and is there any way to quickly fill in for this shortfall?
So I don't think it's specifically 2027, second half of the government. I think it's a really interesting point in this, because there's been a lot of debate, even in Labour, about whether this 28 billion should be stuck. But obviously, you know where my positioning is on that. In practice, announcing 28 billion pounds of capital investment on day one wouldn't all go out of the door in that first year. So in essence, what's happened here is maybe a several month delay at most, but the actual practical process of getting the money announced, going through the process, getting it out into the sectors hasn't massively changed here. But what I think is really important is that if there does end up being a slightly lower amount of total capital investment from the public first, it comes back to that tracking of flows. There should be more than a one-to-one mapping of public to private capital. So we should be above that 50 billion. So even in those first half of the parliament where you're ramping it up, if there's no way to track to see how much private sector money is going into it, ensuring we're still over that target the Committee on Climate Change set out, then we are still meeting what it is that we need to. So I think that's a really important part. And it doesn't take away from the other things we need to do here around regulating the private sector and tracking to see where the money's going.
Okay, the next question I think is probably quite an obvious answer though. What would be the consequence of not having adequate financing to reach net zero?
We simply wouldn't
we don't
achieve.
reach net zero.
Yeah, we simply wouldn't achieve any of the targets that we're setting out. You know, I mean, we talk about a nationwide insulation plan. Even if we have a policy saying gas boilers can be removed by this date, individuals are still going to need support while costs come down to install heat pumps. Even if we say that we need to have every X% of people of journeys being done by walking and cycling, if we don't have that investment into walking and cycling infrastructure, we're not going to meet it. So for every single one of the areas that we need, if we don't achieve this adequate amount of funding, the 50 billion, probably slightly higher now given inflation, then we simply won't meet our targets.
Okay, not just you, but there are many here that are councillors, I know from our guests as well. So what can local authorities like yours do in this policy space?
So local authorities would be key for this delivery. And I mentioned this in my opening spiel, but we have a situation at the minute where local authorities have over 82% of emissions in the country are under the influence of local authorities. Yet, as we all know, we have one of the most centralised political systems in the Western world. And that's a huge issue because we as councillors, we know our local area, we know where the money is going to be best placed, we know how to convince local residents why it needs to go into certain areas. So one thing that's a big issue is that a lot of the money comes from the top when we think, well, I think it should be given to local authorities on a means tested basis. So you can look at the country as a whole, see which councils need, for example, EV charging the most and give them more money on it. In Westminster, we have over 2,000 charging points. It's more than the Northwest in the UK. I'm really happy for Westminster, but we need to enable the rest of the country to scale up to that. And that's obviously a big issue. Another part on the funding, though, is that currently we have a competitive funding landscape for local authorities. So the government will announce a grant, we'll all compete to get it. It costs however much money to get a staff member to write it, several months of work to then potentially get funding. So you can never plan for the longer term. So another thing that I think Labour should be doing if they get into national policy, into national government, is to have this means tested non-competitive funding set out for the longer term so councils can plan. And councillors should advocate for that. Keep advocating for that in your policy discussions.
Thank you. Yes, spot on. Carla.
Thank you. Completely agree on that local government point. You may have noticed half a sentence on that in my pitch as well. My question for you is for you with your Labour Party hat on. So noting your answer about the delay to the 28 billion a year, do you think that even 28 billion a year climate investment is enough? I say that in the context that while recognising that neither your party nor mine has our manifestos for the next general election published yet, in the 2019 manifesto, the Green Party had calculated that we need an investment of about 100 billion a year. And there was various independent think tanks and NGOs that came to a similar number back in 2019. So my opinion is that 28 billion is simply not enough to tackle the climate emergency. What's your take?
So I don't have the Green Party analysis to hand, obviously, but as I've said, we need that minimum of 50 billion, but that's cumulative of public and private. For the research that we've been doing, there should be more than a one-to-one mapping from public to private. So if we have that 28 targeted properly, you should be able to bring in adequate private finance. For example, let's go for owner-occupiers in the home insulation part of the argument. If we're providing that upfront grant, then it should be easier to get add-on mortgages, which would be a private finance amount going in. So my personal opinion is that as long as we're meeting that £50 billion minimum cumulative per annum, then we should be on target. And that's obviously based on Committee on Climate Change modelling, not my own personal opinion. If the CCC was to come out in the 7th carbon budget and say it's nearer to 100 or whatever other number, then I think absolutely there needs to be a course correction to figure out what the amount of public investment needed is. But based on the current analysis to what's meaning that we're missing the 6th carbon budget, I do think that around 30 billion from the public purse, mapping to that above 50 cumulative, should suffice.
Okay, thank you. Vera, let's bring the Lib Dems in on this one now.
So first of all, I had a debate a week ago in actually the main chamber about net zero and local authorities, and we all made the point that it is just ridiculous that councils compete for funding when councils are resource stripped anyway, so wasting a lot of officers' time on putting bids together, and only a small percentage of councils then actually access the funding. So we definitely need to do something to change the model of competitive grant funding. We need to, or competitive funding pots, we need to go to a model of grant funding. I totally agree with that. When I listened to your pitch, right, I thought, all right, because that's what we have to do as politicians. How do I sell that to the public? Because a lot of the stuff that we need to do around the whole of the net zero agenda is to bring the public on board behind us. And the worry I have about what you've just been explaining, because I couldn't understand it, and it took you sort of 20 minutes to explain it. How could you make that a juicy, interesting thing that you stick on a leaflet, because that's what the business that we're into, and make that a really the policy that the public comes behind and say, yeah, I'm going to vote for you on that one. Can you say what you've just said in 15 minutes in one or two?
So I'll quickly caveat this with the fact that in this sort of call with everyone who's watching, I feel like we can go into some of the details, hence why I have. Labour's Climate Environment Forum, which I'm on the advisory group for, is currently looking at this specific question. How can we make these things a bit sexier, a bit snappier, something we can put on a leaflet? From the investment perspective, for me, it's quite simple. It's talking about investing in the jobs of the future. It's talking about creating the economy of the future. It's talking about the economic opportunity that's being missed out. It's talking about reducing energy bills from investing in buildings. Everything that we're all very familiar with is how you would sell it on a leaflet. If people don't want to see the details, the more techie part that we've just gone through, they can open up the manifesto and see the wider details.
So we need something more than just give us the money.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. We're going to move on to Leo, but I think we can come back on some of this later, if that's okay. So, and thank you very much. Let me just scooting up, sorry, in my notes here. Because I think this is interesting, and it actually segues nicely, and this wasn't planned, but we've been talking about the private finance, we've been talking about the getting the money in, but Leo comes from an organisation that very much puts this back to the people, and saying that the people and communities need to get involved as well. So Leo is co-founder and director of innovation and engagement at Possible. Possible wants to see a zero carbon society built by and for the people of the UK. They argue that the climate movement must be a mass movement, or it simply won't achieve its aims. And if we're going to move at the speed required, then this has to come from people and communities, not just politicians. So over to Leo.
Thanks so much. I've been enjoying the positioning. I'm not attached to a party, so I've limited my comments to now. But look, our work at Possible is all about how to leverage the current demands, the urgent demands of the climate crisis and the rapid decarbonisation agenda to improve people's lives today. Our theory of change is that we can't get to the scale and pace of the emissions reductions that are needed without active mass public participation in the transition away from fossil fuels. And to achieve that, you need a propositional approach. It is not enough to just scare people about the horror show that awaits if we don't act on the climate crisis. We also have to find ways to get people excited about how things can be better, how we can solve real problems with the status quo by doing what needs to be done about climate change. So to this end, as a sidebar, we spent many years focusing on trying to scale community energy. Decentralizing and democratizing our energy system is very popular, and it can go hand in glove with decarbonising it. Getting together with neighbours to do something practical and positive about the climate crisis brings material rewards to your neighbourhood. What is not to love? Sadly, we had to move away from encouraging people to get involved in community energy because the Tories destroyed the entire policy framework that was making it possible. And trying to get a scheme off the ground is now like waiting for your treacle. It's very draining. It's difficult to make progress. But in truth, although the UK's energy system, its electricity system, the power sector, has been rapidly decarbonising even without much community involvement. Emissions from transport, meanwhile, have not. They are almost no lower today than they were in 1990. That is Britain's baseline year for carbon emissions reductions. In 2019, transport made up well over a quarter of UK greenhouse gas emissions. Over 9/10 of that is road transport, and over 60% of that is cars and taxis. And the fundamental reason for this has been the powerful and ongoing aversion of successive governments of all stripes to even try to do anything meaningful to address the central problem, which is that we have placed the private car, which is a phenomenally wasteful and inefficient mode of transport, at the centre of our transport system. Now, this did not happen by accident. It didn't happen organically or thanks to consumer demand. It is literally the product of 75 years of very deliberate policy, fiscal, regulatory, infrastructure, investment decisions, which explicitly sought to motorise British society. Motorways did not build themselves. Thousands of miles of railways didn't die of natural causes. They were closed by government ministers who wanted people to buy and use cars instead. That's how we got to the situation we're in today. Now look, it's very clear. Electrification of our entire road vehicle fleet will be necessary. I don't want to, not knocking EVs. Electrification of motorised travel is the keystone technology for transport decarbonisation. However, there is a growing expert consensus that it will not be sufficient to meet our national climate commitments on its own. A large and rapid absolute reduction in vehicle miles being driven on our roads will also be required. Consequently, governments in Scotland, Wales and London have also unprecedented car use and motor traffic reduction targets for the coming year. Hackney Council is targeting a 15% traffic reduction by 2026. At the UK level, we're pretending this isn't happening. Westminster, the Conservative government have completely disavowed that there really is a requirement here for traffic to fall. But the expert consensus is that it needs to fall by somewhere between 20 to 60% by 2030, right? We may need to halve traffic volumes in the next 7 years. Now that depends on how fast we switch the road fleet to EVs. And this level of traffic reduction, totally unprecedented. Traffic has basically gone up in almost every year since the Second World War. And even that 20% figure relies on, if it's as low as 20%, that would require the UK to have Norwegian levels of EV uptake, which we don't have today. We don't have the right policies in place to achieve. Thankfully, right, the good news here is that urban planners have known for many years that towns and cities are much better places to live, work, study, visit with fewer cars. Motorisation turns out to have been a disaster for urban communities. So designing cars back out of our inner urban centres altogether and transcending car dependence for city dwellers will yield vast health benefits to urban populations through reduced exposure to toxic air and increased levels of physical activity, as well as productivity and well-being benefits that come from reduced congestion and road danger. It's a rare example of a win-win-win-win-win situation for climate action. It's just really, really bloody hard to make happen in practice. And if we don't start properly right away, it will become impossible and transport will get away from us. And the only way to meet climate goals will literally be to curtail mobility. Right? Nobody wants that. And actually, I don't believe any politician in charge will ever do it, right? To curtail mobility per se, absolutely a vote killer. Whereas getting cars out of cities, every time we do it, everyone's like, oh, actually, this is great. you get hit with backlash, horrible backlash, death threats, people kick off. We've seen it over the last few years. But if you can see through that process of change, there are no examples of traffic reduction schemes being removed that have been in place for a couple of years. No examples globally, right? There are many examples where there's been a lot of hostility and backlash. Sometimes things get taken out at the point of introduction or just after, when people are experiencing massive disruption. So look, this goes well beyond rolling out a few cycle lanes, low traffic neighborhoods at a local level. We are talking about a fundamental reordering of how people in our society get around on a day-to-day basis. Crucially, we're also talking about an absolutely vast investment in public transport, which doesn't really appear to be on anyone's radar at present. So that is why we think that cutting car traffic should be at the top of the climate policy agenda for any new government next year. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Leo. I was going to ask whether you supported phasing out the purchase of private cars, but I think you kind of answered that there, that it's not about taking people's mobility away from them. It's about focusing on the city centres first. And I also had a question. I see Vera's also got her hand up there as well, which is fantastic. I just wanted to ask though, because the ultra low emission zones and the low traffic neighbourhoods have been very controversial. Certainly within the Bylines network, we've had articles and people writing that have really felt that, because they're new in their areas and they've had bollards suddenly placed at the end of their street and they can't get round, and it's all. So regardless of their merit, which you've made out already, what can policymakers do to ensure that there is more common community buy-in to these changes?
So it's a really good question, and I have to say that despite, we're a community focused organization, and so we spent all these years doing community energy, which people are always very keen on, right? Extremely uncontroversial, right? Everybody loves renewable energy. Doesn't matter what your political stripe is. Everyone always thinks community energy is a good idea, and for reasons of their own, the Tory government just destroyed the policy framework for it. When it comes to this stuff, you will not get consensus, right? It's not possible to do. So I have read over the last 3 years, we've been running a big program of work called Car Free Cities, which has been looking at this problem, right? It comes from the academic literature, which says we need to cut car use. It's really clear that has to happen in cities first, right? Because it's very, very difficult to meet people's mobility needs when they live in a diffuse area. You just can't do that with regular public transport. And obviously walking and cycling is difficult if you're 2 miles from the nearest shop, right? If you're 2 miles from the nearest population centre. So it's got to start in cities. What we've learned is that this stuff follows an incredibly consistent pattern. It's not just in the UK, it is the world over, which is that it's the Goodwin curve, right? There's an transport academic called Phil Goodwin, who postulated, he did a study looking at early examples of road user pricing, and reached this conclusion that everything follows the same pattern, right? You start out very low, where there's low alignment. People don't know that there's a problem, right? So there's not lots of public support for doing something about it. But over time, that climbs, and then you get alignment, and you get lots of people saying, there's too much traffic, we need traffic to fall. Now that is actually where the UKA is at the moment. There is a very strong perception, doesn't matter about your political background, that there is too much traffic. People will volunteer that. You don't need to say, is there too much traffic? You can say, tell me about the problems in your city. They will say, there's too much traffic, right? Everyone agrees there's too much traffic. But when you start to propose what you're actually going to do about it, when details begin to emerge, public support for it crashes. And actually, in fact, and there's lots of data from public polling around from the last few years, in fact, it never falls to the levels which you would think it was at from reading about it in newspapers or logging on to Nextdoor. In fact, you actually consistently have a basically silent majority in favour of this stuff. But proposing this stuff triggers loss aversion for people who experience it as a personal attack on them, their lifestyles, right, their own freedoms. And they will be triggered to throw everything at the kitchen sink at stopping the thing from happening. And so you get this period, which is the nadir, the bottom of the Goodwin curve, is just before you've implemented your change, during the process of implementation, and the period immediately afterwards, which is always disruptive. That's the bottom of the Goodwin curve. many politicians brick it at that point because the only voices that they can hear are people shouting at them about how their lives are being ruined. You're going to put my business out of business. This stuff is utterly consistent, right? Shopkeepers are just wrong about how many people drive to their shops, right? There may be shopkeepers on this call. There's multiple studies. They overestimate the share of their clientele that come by car by like 300-400% typically, right? People react a small number of people react in a very, very, very hostile way to this stuff. There isn't a good way of doing it. I've read an enormous amount of commentary saying, oh, this council's done it wrong because, they didn't do the consultation right, or they designed the scheme wrong. The only thing that unites the schemes that have succeeded and have persisted from the last few years and have gone on to become permanent is the courage and resolve of the politicians responsible for delivering the schemes. Right, there's no consistency. Otherwise, there's no other common features of these things, right?
Okay, right.
So that is the advice. The answer to your question is politicians just need to be prepared to be shouted at. People will be very angry with you for a bit, but at the end of the Goodwin curve is the sunlit uplands where no one ever wants to go back. And everyone's like, actually, this is so much better now.
Sunlit uplands here.
It's so much better without all the traffic.
I'm just going to bring Vera in because I don't want to run out of time before her speech. So Vera, you had a question as well that maybe.
Well, but by talking about it, you have explained a little bit more what really your policy is to give local politicians particularly a dose of confidence that they can see through this stuff. But I don't know how a prime minister or whatever is elected for the first thing that they do, or a climate lead in the government would make that happen. I agree. I was a local councillor. I introduced alternate weekly collections. I tell you, it was exactly that. I had the Daily Mail on my doorstep. People hated it. I was very intimidated by absolutely everybody. I stuck to my guns. We did change a few things. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but you need to have a lot of courage to do this sort of thing. And it is true in Rochdale, where I was a local councillor, they've gone to 3 weekly landfill collections. Yeah, it does work, but you need to really have the staying power, and you need to have a lot of thick skin, and you need to have a lot of good health as well. So I would love to have something where actually councillors are less stressed than what you're just currently proposing, because councillors have got, and there's lots of councillors on this call, and I sympathise with you. I've done the job for 10 years. You've got a lot of stress anyway. So I wouldn't actually want to add to their stress, Leo, although I agree entirely of what you're saying. But if you give me something where this one could be done without all that hardship that local councils and local councils have to go through, I would be fully on board with it. But currently, that's not the case. It's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay, so then look, my retort to that would be, actually, do we plan to meet these targets? Because if we actually plan to fulfill our climate promises, this stuff has to happen. And so the lesson that I think, the insight that I can offer from our program the last 3 years, looking at this stuff, not just in the UK, but all around the world, is to map the Goodwin curve onto your electoral cycle, because ultimately the cost to you will come the next time you have to stand for election. Yeah, sure, it's unpleasant to be shouted at by people at a community consultation event, right? But ultimately the cost to you is if you lose your seat. Now, the smart move, and this is why I'm making the case that a new government should do this, the first thing that it should do is rip off the plaster, grasp the nettle. You just have to get in there and do it really early in your electoral cycle, so that all the controversy and all the fury, the caps lock fury in your mailbox, happens at the early part of your electoral cycle and is in your rearview mirror and is basically receding into memory by the time you're standing for election again. So I don't know if that's helpful, Vera.
But thank you, Leo. I think we should do a lot of things by doing that. That's brilliant. Thank you. In actual fact, we're going to wrap your session up now and introduce Vera for the last speaker of the evening. And don't forget, if you haven't already voted, there'll be a second poll later to see whether your opinions have been swayed by tonight's debate. So Vera, as is Liberal Democrat MP for Bath and the party's spokesperson for energy and climate change and transport. She was born in Hanover, Germany, and studied history and fine art in Germany, then in France, then again in Germany. Before entering politics, Vera was a teacher, radio journalist, and artist. When she was first elected to Parliament, she stood on a pro-EU platform and is known to many of us through her campaigning around Brexit. Tonight, however, she is speaking on energy. Over to you, Vera.
Well, thank you. I tried to be brief because we already had a very rich discussion around a lot of issues where we are ultimately agreeing. We are agreeing on the urgency with which we need to do this stuff. We agree that actually all things need to happen almost at the same time. And I just want to quickly talk about our election manifesto, our climate change plan that we put to the people and in 2019. So the Liberal Democrat plan to get to net zero by 2045 was sort of basically breaking down all sectors into what we needed to do parallel. But the main thing is, of course, that we need to understand whether we're doing home insulation, there's still energy left that needs to be produced. When we are talking about the road system, as we have heard, there's still energy at the bottom of it. And for me, it remains the most important thing that we have to transform our energy system. This is where our energy is coming from. And we all understand that at some point, fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. And how do we actually transition successfully without having the backlash that everybody's always talking about? How do we transition successfully to an energy system that is net zero? And what I'm seeing time and again here in Westminster, which is so frustrating, is actually barriers are being put into the way of creating renewables. And this is where I'd say, if I was a prime minister or if I was the energy minister, we should remove all barriers to renewables now, because whatever you do, whether that's community energy, Leo, and I'm very much on for community energy, but if you're a small producer of renewable energy, if you're a large producer of renewable energy, what you find are barriers. The grid connection takes years, the planning system takes years. We are all talking about that renewables are good, but when you go into the detail of it, the current government is putting barriers in form of also contracts for difference. They work because they keep the energy prices low, but they're ultimately restricting the amount of renewables that we are building in this country, be that wind, be that solar, be that marine energy. And on marine energy, I could talk all afternoon that we've actually removed most of our projects that we can do as marine energy, which could act as base load. Everybody talks about nuclear. Our plan actually excludes nuclear, and we might be agreed in this forum that we don't need to have nuclear. So we need a lot of renewables, and we need to overproduce renewables. And therefore, my thing, we need to overproduce renewables. I see you, Louise, sort of asking why, because people will always say, but the wind is not always blowing or the sun is not always shining. So we need to overproduce renewables to go into batteries and to go into green hydrogen, which is ultimately something that we also need to have for our transport system. A lot of transportation has to ultimately, particularly heavy transport, needs to be resolved through hydrogen, but not blue hydrogen, because we can only have blue hydrogen if we extract fossil fuels again and then do carbon capture and storage. But as I said before, we need to keep the whole stuff in the ground. So let's do hydrogen through green hydrogen. We can only get to green hydrogen by a massive overproduction of renewables. So my headline would be, just remove all barriers from renewables that we currently still have in the system. That would be my policy, and that would be what I would do if I was a prime minister or the energy minister.
I wasn't frowning. I was trying to read a question coming in at the same time. So yes, thank you. You talk about the barriers that they are. And I know you've done a very quick sort of 5 minutes there. What are the key barriers that you would remove there? So is it skills shortage, material shortage? What would be your sort of first steps to doing that?
So of course, skill shortages we have across the board, but actually in the renewable sector, that's not really the problem. The problem is that a lot of renewable energy projects are waiting in the pipeline. And one of the biggest barriers are, for example, grid connections. They take forever. So we need a massive expansion of the grid. There's big, but the government is only expanding the grid according to how many renewable projects are there. And then some renewable projects are putting themselves forward and are not as deliverable as others, but that puts blockages into the system for grid connections. So we need to do something about grid connections, but we need to get into a mindset where we are not saying currently, as the government does it, we only need so much renewables. We need more renewables. We need not just quadrupling the amount of renewables. We need to be doing it 5 times, 8 times, 10 times. We can not have enough renewables. We can export it. We can do European grid connections where we are exporting our renewable energy. We in Britain, if we could be a world leader in anything, we could be a world leader in renewable energy because we have lots and lots of natural resources. We've got water, we've got wind, and yes, we also have some sunshine. All of that should be used and not held back. And for example, when it comes to solar panels, you know, currently I don't get anything for if I individually install a solar panel. So if I install a solar panel, most of the energy that I feed back into the grid, it's a profit for the energy company, not for the individual householder. The barriers around that should also be removed. An individual householder who is putting the investment forward of 15,000, 20,000 pounds to put a solar array on their rooftop, and I think we should have a rooftop explosion really, but you need to create incentives for the people who are doing that, the private householder, for example, to get actually money back for the energy I produce on a daily basis that I don't use. Currently, that is very little and it's not an incentive. So again, more could be done to create incentives and remove barriers. So I call all of that barriers to more renewables. They need to be removed.
Okay, thank you. Carla.
Thank you. Well, obviously, as Green Party co-leader and former renewable energy engineer, I agree with all of that. I have a question for you. You mentioned the problem with grid connection, and I agree that is the problem for hundreds of wind and solar farms that have somehow miraculously made it through the very anti-renewables Tory planning system. They've got permission, and then they still have to wait years for a grid connection, especially in my and your region of the southwest, where the grid is not very strong when you get into rural areas. My opinion and the Green Party's opinion is that part of the solution to that has to be to bring the national grid back into public ownership so that the government can execute its policy through the national grid, because the problem is that they're making business decisions at the moment that aren't looking out for the long-term decarbonisation strategy of the country. What is your and the Lib Dems' opinion on that?
Well, we think we can do it through better regulation. So that's and currently, you know, one of the things that we have called for, and I think the energy bill is actually bringing, you know, making that possible, is that through an Ofgem remit change, because Ofgem currently only has the remit of keeping the energy costs low for consumers. It hasn't got a net zero remit in its net zero commitment in its remit. That needs to be the first thing that needs to change, because then the national grid could make preemptive investments, which currently they can't do. They can only invest in expanding the grid infrastructure if they have projects in the pipeline, and it becomes a circular thing because renewable companies are having to wait for such a long time. So if Ofgem could actually put in an investment into the grid that allowed it to be preemptive before actual projects are already there, then we could get bigger and faster grid expansion, and we need a massive grid expansion that is currently not happening. So we are currently thinking it can be done by actually changing all sorts of making technical changes, but also having better regulation rather than bringing the national grid back into government ownership. I'm personally not unsympathetic to what you're saying, but I'm here also as a spokesperson for the Liberal Democrats, so I can't make policy off the hoof. Currently, that is not Lib Dem policy, but I hear what you're saying.
Thank you. Ryan.
Thanks, Louise. Another of my questions is also going to be about nationalisation. I will flag that obviously part of National Grid is being nationalised with the future systems operators. That's obviously positive. Really agree with you on the overproducing of renewables. I think there's a 15, 20 billion pound export opportunity for us. I think if we do overproduce, put it into Europe. My question then is around, obviously, Labour's announced GB Energy, the National Wealth Fund, which is being seeded by the Green Prosperity Plan. Some of that will involve ownership of assets. Where do the Lib Dems stand on ownership of some of these storage assets being developed, some of the energy generation that we need going forward?
Well, as I said before, our general attitude to all of this is that if a government has got a tough regulatory system, it doesn't need to own everything. Yeah, it can actually make this happen by having a very clear oversight of what it wants to achieve with the assets, and regulate the assets in a, the private assets in a way to get the outcomes that are for the common good or for the national good outcome. So that is our general approach to all assets, whether that's water companies or whether that's trains and whatever it is. That is currently Lib Dem policy, and I as I said to Carla, I hear other parties' demands for bringing some of these things, like, for example, public monopolies, which energy ultimately is, or water is, back into government ownership. I think I'm personally on a slightly different path of thinking than the rest of my colleagues, so it needs some internal persuasion, but I cannot today say bringing these sort of assets back into public ownership is Lib Dem policy. That would be incorrect. But I hear what you're saying, but I also think that my party has got a point of really saying, and a lot of what is happening in Germany, and I come originally from Germany, so our thing was always the soziale Marktwirtschaft. So it wasn't about that everything needs to be done and owned by the state, but we needed a strong government in order to intervene with very tough regulations and knowing what they wanted to do. Whereas the current government, of course, doesn't do that. Ultimately, the current government wants private profit, yeah, and we are draining so much public funds into actually private pockets. It's unbelievable. We've seen that, with all the COVID contracts. So, but that is it's a Tory philosophy that I don't share. But I'm a Liberal Democrat. I stand in the middle of that. I think that actually the state doesn't need to own everything, but a state needs to be prepared for very tough regulation and making sure, yes, that there's some profit for private businesses, but not the excessive profits that we are currently seeing, and making sure private business operates and works, but that it is ultimately doing it for the public good. And that is about tough regulation.
Thank you. Leo.
Thanks. I guess, reflecting on this, I don't disagree with anything that you've said, Mira, and I'm very close to this personally. We've got renewable energy projects. I guess what I would query is why should renewables be the priority when really renewables are the success story that renewables have won. So they, in economic terms, they're just cheaper. It's onshore wind has been the cheapest source of new electricity in the country for years. Obviously, the Tories have banned it, sure, but it is the area of I've just pulled up the Green Alliance climate policy tracker and looked across the different sectors, and basically the power sector is like green. It's mainly green, right? I accept that there are these problems with the grid. I accept onshore wind is. But actually, every other sector of the economy, the government is failing worse, right? We've made much less progress. Nearly all of the decarbonisation that the government loves to trumpet in the UK economy that has taken place to date has come from decarbonisation of the power sector. So it's almost like it's a huge success story. And I speak about renewables a lot as the thing that we've actually winning on. And it's, it's a success of public policy. It worked exactly as intended. The subsidies brought private sector investment in, scaled up the market. Now we've got huge economies of scale. Brilliant. But I'm still left like, but this is the thing we've done really well. All this other stuff hasn't had any attention at all.
But so first of all, only about, I can't remember, but only about 40% of our electricity is currently coming from renewables. So I have got an electric car, and I know I'm still driving a car. I hear what you're saying about people shouldn't have individual cars. I sort of agree with that, but that's currently what people do. But still, when I'm charging my car, a lot of the energy is not renewable. So we have to go a lot further than we currently do. And as soon as I decarbonize the electricity system entirely, not just by 40%, then that also helps me to decarbonize how we're doing our home heating or how we do decarbonize our transport system. So at the bottom of all of this is ultimately the energy with which we power everything. That is even the case for our heavy industry. That's the case for everything. The whole of the world has been powered by fossil fuels, and this is why it is obviously so difficult to get to net zero, because it's in everything. So how do we quickly get away from the fossil fuels that have dominated all our lives across the world? And that can only be, unless you think it should be solar, I mean, apart from saving energy, but even if we save a lot of energy, we still have to use energy. The only thing we need to do is move from fossil fuel power generation to renewable power generation. That is the bottom of everything.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I want to have even more questions. What I'm going to say is, if the moderators can now put the second survey into the chat, we can carry on talking while everyone votes again. Well, I have one more question though, Vera, if that's okay for you, and it's probably a yes, no, but you may want to give more. Should the UK follow some other EU countries and withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty?
Yes, that's it. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
that's
and have a renewable charter treatment or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, right, thank you. So based on the initial question that we asked, I can say that, I'm just looking here at what Sam put in, Ryan has the winning pitch first time over. So the question is now, does Ryan still have the winning pitch? So if everyone can now vote while we carry on talking, and we can see it is a single transferable vote, and giving a little bit more detail, he beat Vera out 60% to 40% in the final round. I'm probably talking gibberish, but I think that means Vera came second on the first round. So let's see what we have now for Carla, for Ryan, for Leo and Vera for the last round. But while we're just waiting, while people are talking, there was one question that came in earlier that was for everyone. It's picking up on what you've already mentioned, Vera, so we'll start with you, which is, where do each of the panel, or where does each of the panel stand on tidal and the prospect that the UK could be a world leader, unlike wind, where most technology is foreign owned, even if manufactured here? And there was a historical note added: the UK was a world leader in wind till the market collapsed around 1990. The Germans, Danes, etc. rescued their industries. Are we about to repeat history? So I think, Vera, over to you. Where do we stand on, or where do you stand on tidal?
Or tidal or marine energy, whatever you want to call it, absolutely. The government has now reduced again the funding that goes into a next CFD round. So we need to do a lot more. And I think we have got so much potential for that. I know that some of the big projects have raised question marks about environmental impact. So the only thing that I would say is we need to work from the onset, but that is for any renewable energy projects as well, with organizations like marine conservation, these sort of or the ISPB, that we are making sure that environmental organizations are there from the very beginning of the planning process, that we don't create the environmental issues that could arise from these very, very big projects. But otherwise, yes, absolutely, we need to do a lot more about marine energy. It could be what I said before, one of our, because it's always there, obviously not always through the day, but it could provide baseload that so many people are calling for. Although the concept of baseload is something that was produced by the nuclear industry, because basically you can't stop a nuclear power station. We know that, we see that with Zaporizhzhia power station. It's very difficult, or it takes a long time to stop it. So we need an energy source that you can turn on and off at demand. But the idea of a baseload is actually quite outdated thinking, but I know it's in a lot of people's mind, because it's a way of bashing renewables and say, oh, but they're not always there. So yes, marine energy, we need it.
I'm going to ask Carla now. Where do you stand on marine tidal energy?
Yeah, tidal and offshore energy, offshore renewable energy definitely support the number crunching that our energy policy boffins did in the Green Party has worked out that we think we could provide about 70% of UK electricity from wind, onshore and offshore combined, but that still leaves an important 30%, which would be a mixture of solar, tidal, and a few other bits and bobs. I agree with Vera that you do need to take account of the ecological impact, and that may mean, for example, rather than having a 7 barrage, having a tidal fence or lagoons or some other technology which does generate a bit less energy but also has much less ecological impact. And I think in the last few years especially, we've learnt that, well, we have not learnt, we have been reminded that you know, humans are part of ecology, and really we need the entire ecological system to survive, not just reducing carbon emissions. So that is important. But yeah, as you said, tidal energy, one of the wonderful things about it is that while it is how predictable it is. So when I worked in the renewable sector, I worked in estimating how much wind farms would generate on and offshore. And so I know firsthand that while renewable energy is variable, it's not unpredictable. You can, you know, our weather forecasting in this country is good these days. And if you can predict it a few days ahead, and then even more accurately a few hours ahead, then you can vary the demand, whether it's by giving factories an incentive to ramp down production for a little bit and then back up, or whether it's using people's connection when they plug their electric vehicles in the evening to just slow down the charging for a few hours and then speed it back up. So there's lots of smart demand management that you can do on that. But tidal is really good because tidal energy generation, you can predict hundreds of years in advance because tides are so predictable. So it's an important part of the mix.
Fantastic. Ryan.
Yeah, to not rehash what's just been said, the predictability is so important with tidal. I would personally see it as being below in terms of the percentage it's going to supply wind and solar, so much as Carla's just sat up there. From an investor's perspective, obviously wind followed this trajectory where CFDs were brought in. There was massive government support, which saw the cost of wind fall drastically. And at one point, we obviously had the most offshore wind in the world until China recently overtook us. Now, that's a really important lesson. Leo always said earlier that renewables is held up as the success story. The offshore wind public-private approach to it is often held up in the investment industry as a great way to scale investment. Tidal had CFD access, and then it didn't. And then it got it again recently, which is good, but it needs to have that on a sustained basis now. And tidal currently, I think, comes in cheaper than nuclear. And over the longer term, it will gradually get cheaper and cheaper. So absolutely think it should be a fundamental part of our renewable energy offer. It's not the top part though, but we should keep giving support to it at the same time, massively scaling up demand side response, scaling up storage and the other things that currently don't get the level of support they need.
I will not repeat things that others have said, but I would just add that, you know, the problem at the moment, the reason why we haven't brought forward any tidal is, you know, it's absolutely criminal that the Swansea Lagoon didn't go ahead, because the reason why is it's chronically undervalued, right? So it is very expensive at the capital end to deliver tidal. We have an incredible resource here in the UK, and when I say it's chronically undervalued, what I mean is, from the perspective of a future energy system that is dominated by wind and solar, you have patterns of generation which is asynchronous is the term, right? So your tidal generation happens at a different time, basically, from your solar. You know, if everything is following that same profile of generation from solar and wind, other sources that are not solar or wind but are also renewable are disproportionately valuable from the system, from the whole system's perspective. And we have failed to recognize that at the front end, you know, and these are century assets, right? If you build the building the Swansea Lagoon, yeah, you'd have to change the turbines after a few decades, but you're talking about something which is going to last for, you know, well north of 100 years, and can double up as storage as well, because, you know, you can, if you choose, hold back in the reservoir in a tidal lagoon. The only thing I would say is there's not a very good industrial strategy argument for it, and the problem, you know, the reason why one of the reasons why it has been neglected is that it's very difficult to achieve the economy of scale thing that you have got from contracts for difference, because there are only a limited number of sites, and that is even true all around the world. We have the best tidal resource of any country, and so we need it here, but there's not an enormous export market, and, you know, there are a limited number of sites, so you can't really rely on that same mechanism working in the same way that
I'm going to instruct you just because results are in. I know this is what we've been eagerly awaiting. So, Ryan, you did start leading with 46% of the vote. However, Carla has edged you into second place and has won tonight's vote on 54% of the vote. It wasn't quite 52-48, but well done, Carla. Well done, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for some incredibly inspirational speeches tonight and debates. And proving, I think, as Sam intended at the start, which is that we can have a wonderfully healthy debate, all coming together from the progressive sphere, bringing lots of different perspectives, but singing from the same hymn sheet too. So thank you so much, everyone. If anyone isn't already writing for the Bylines Network, please do. We welcome all of your input, and have a lovely evening, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Cheers.